Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
In every aspect of life, new ideas and new values were taking over in France. Even Louis XVI supported the American Revolution. These were the people who lit the fuse, the educated, the better off. And these were the people who exploded. The death of the old regime, this time on the Western tradition.
And now, UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
The American Revolution that I talked about last time deserves our attention not only for its own sake, but also because it was the first of a long series of revolutions that were to mark the years from 1776 onwards, a series that isn't over yet. And the revolution was doubly significant because the men and the women who made it and those who got involved in it managed to solve its central problem in a way that makes it rather different from the other revolutions that we have seen since then. Revolution, you see, is rather like a snowball on a slope. It's not easy to get it going, but once it's on its way, it is hard to stop it rolling and growing until it becomes an avalanche. And the problem in America was to stop the revolution for independence from snowballing into a popular and democratic revolution. The Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation had marked the triumph of the democratic view, which favored popular sovereignty and little government. The Federalist Papers and the Constitution, on the other hand, marked a sort of counter-revolution of those who distrusted the people and who believed in strong government. To the Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, democracy was nearly anarchy. And the way to prevent power from slipping into the hands of an illiterate mob was to have government by the best people in the land, people like Hamilton himself, who could be trusted to use power in a moderate and responsible fashion. So at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, a constitution was designed that was democratic enough to be adopted, but not democratic enough to threaten the power and the controlling position of the upper and propertied classes. And this is what is so special, so unusual about the American Revolution, that it very soon stopped being a revolution, that the snowball was stopped before it became an avalanche. Even democratic leaders were able to indulge in the luxury of very revolutionary, very radical ideas while living and acting in a very conservative manner. It was possible to declare that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were inalienable rights of all men, and to provide legal protection for slavery. It was possible to declare that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and to accept a constitution that did not provide for direct representation. So the American Revolution was ambivalent, both conservative and revolutionary. It could remain conservative because in relative terms, The conservatism of colonial Americans was more radical by the general standards of Europeans at the time. And conveniently, the deepest reactionaries in America, the loyalists who clung to king and empire and who might have forced a deeper radicalization by their intransigence, the loyalists left or were forced to leave, mostly for Canada. And those who remained could afford to remain relatively conservative, simply because the colonies had never known oppression and because, as human institutions go, America always had been free, excepting, of course, for slavery. On the other hand, the American Revolution was revolutionary because the colonists took the risks of rebellion and because they checkmated those Americans who wanted a society like the aristocratic society of England and the rest of Europe. But most of all, the revolution was revolutionary because it showed how certain abstract doctrines, such as the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people, could be, as John Adams put it, could be reduced to practice by assemblies of pretty level-headed gentlemen exercising constituent power in the name of the people. The effects of all this on Europe were very important. The revolution inspired the sense of a new era. It added new substance to the concept of progress, a whole new dimension to the ideas of liberty and equality that the Enlightenment had spread abroad. It got people into the habit of thinking more concretely about political questions. It made them more readily critical of their own governments and their own system. It dethroned England as the inspiration of enlightened thinkers and set up America as the model for a better world. It brought written constitutions, declarations of rights, constituent conventions into the realm of the possible. Above all, perhaps, America made Europe seem unsatisfactory to a lot of people in the middle and the lower classes, and to those members of the upper classes who sympathized with them. It made a lot of Europeans feel sorry for themselves. And it induced a kind of spiritual flight from the old regime and from the values that it represented. But all this was happening in Europe, not in America. What it comes down to is that the American Revolution, in its doctrinal aspects, opened up the possibilities of political change, possibilities far wider than was necessary in practice in the America of 1776, but not in Europe. So while the formal example of revolution may have been given in Philadelphia, the effective example was going to be given in Paris. It was 1789 and the storming of the Bastille, not 1776, that set Europe on fire. And it is the French Revolution, not the American, which puts the question of the price of revolution, which gives us the certainty that there will always be a very high price to pay. And it leaves us wondering, when everything is said and done, whether even that high price will actually pay for the goods ordered, for the changes and advantages we might expect from revolution. In considering the French Revolution, the first thing we have to remember is how popular the very idea of revolution had become in Europe in this last quarter of the 18th century. You find village priests who keep the encyclopedia and the works of the philosophers on their bookshelves. You find laborers and peasants reading pamphlets about the new ideas, or being read to if they can't read themselves. You have the tremendous popularity of a man like Lafayette, returned from the American War to become a hero at home. and Benjamin Franklin, who becomes a kind of saint of the Enlightenment. And, of course, you have the philosophes. None of the philosophes actually advocated violent revolution, but their writings spread revolutionary ideas, and along with the books and pamphlets that were remaking the European mind, especially the French mind, there was propaganda for radical change heard in the fashionable salons of Paris, in cafes, and in societies of every kind which were founded in great numbers at this time. Agricultural societies, philanthropical associations, provincial academies, correspondence societies, and reading rooms where people could not only read but talk. The Masonic lodges especially were favorable to philosophical infiltration because they had the same ideals as the philosophes: civil equality, religious toleration, the liberation of the human personality from all institutions that kept it immature. And the lodges didn't include just bourgeois, but priests and nobles, and even the brothers of Louis XVI. Then there was the theatre. A playwright like Beaumarchais, whose patron was Queen Marie Antoinette. A man like Beaumarchais was busy writing subversive comedies like The Marriage of Figaro, which raised doubts about the value of noble birth. Marie Antoinette even acted in his plays for fun, while the king used Beaumarchais to supply arms to the American rebels, and in the hands of another Mason, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Figaro became the hero of an immensely popular opera, and Masonic ideas provided the core of an even greater opera, The Magic Flute. The virtues of humanity were also affirmed by a new interest in the necessary virtues of the citizen. And this went along with a revival of the classical models of good citizenship in Greece and especially Rome. You remember the Rhode Island patriot who wanted to awaken all that was Roman in Providence. Well, a lot of the rhetoric of 18th century revolution referred to the resolute and ruthless heroes of the Roman Republic who sacrificed themselves and everybody else in the interests of state and society. Some of the most effective propaganda in this line was produced by painters. And the most representative of these was probably Jacques-Louis David, the harbinger of revolution in art. In 1784, the year after the Peace of Paris ended the American Revolution, David painted a scene called the Oath of the Horatii that had been originally inspired by a tragedy of Corneille. The story of the three Horace brothers who go off to fight for Rome, swearing before their father that they're going to win or die. David's historical scenes were invariably manifestos for stoicism, courage, civic spirit. They were seen as an indictment of effete aristocratic ways and an advertisement for a return to the stern, patriotic morals of Republican Rome. So David became a culture hero, and in 1789 he painted another classical scene of Brutus, the Roman consul, receiving the corpses of his own sons whom he had condemned to death for treachery. It wasn't just the moral uplift, it wasn't just the political implication, it was also the setting and the costumes that made a strong statement for the simple virtues, for a sober architecture without curves or curlicues, for dress and furniture that were spare and simple, and by implication virtuous. This had a tremendous impact on fashion. Virtue doesn't come easily, but dressing in a virtuous style does. So men cut their hair short in the Roman style, a la Brutus, and women adopted the dresses and the hairdos of Brutus's daughters, and eventually the really up-to-date adopted the very flimsy dresses that the Sabine women were supposed to have worn when the Romans stole them away, with straight lines and practically no underwear, and the breasts exposed and nowhere to keep a hanky or a key, which in turn introduced another novelty, the ridicule or reticule, which was the ancestor of our handbags. So in every aspect of life, new values were taking over. Indeed, by the 1780s, these new values and ideas had been around so long that they didn't seem very new or very revolutionary. People were beginning to take them for granted. And even the people against whom they were directed, the aristocrats, were beginning to take them for granted. But they were playing with fire. Louis XVI, for instance, had supported the American rebels and helped them win their revolution. French noblemen like the Marquis de Lafayette had fought in the American army and had become heroes in France because they fought for a cause that the whole machinery of the French state was geared to crush at home. At the same time, the monarchy was growing weaker because its finances had been undermined by the cost of war across the Atlantic. The American Revolution had cost France the equivalent of 4 years' revenues. Most of this had been raised by borrowing. More than half of every year's budget had to go just to paying the interest on the debt. And all sorts of other things were going wrong. The weather was bad, the crops were bad, the price of bread was getting higher and higher, wages stood still, prices went up, and so did the taxes that a desperate government trying to make ends meet was trying to squeeze out of the taxpayers. And since a lot of the French were not taxpayers, because nobles and clergy and officers of the crown didn't have to pay anything, the burden fell on the people least able to pay them. This last factor was very important because the mass of people would not have been stirred by theories if they hadn't been suffering in practice. And they were suffering terribly, even though the economic problems of France were not insuperable. These problems could have been solved, at least in part, by a government that knew its mind. The deficit could have been made up, the national debt could have been handled, but to do this, you had to break the privileges of the privileged, you had to break the privileges especially of the clergy and the nobility. You had to make them pay taxes. You had to cut the pensions that were sucking the treasury dry. Just one family of royal favorites, the Polignacs, were getting pensions equivalent to 1.5% of the annual revenues of the crown for doing nothing, but for doing it very gracefully. If you could do away with pensions and tax exemptions, you could probably set the country's finances on an even keel. But of course, none of this was done. So here was a repetition in many ways of the situation in the American colonies. The French government, like the British, tried to tighten things up for the sake of efficiency and for greater revenues, and it was opposed at first by certain privileged groups, nobles, clergy, gentlemen, lawyers, and intellectuals. Although there was a background of discontent, it didn't have to explode unless the fuses were lit, and the people who lit them were, as in America, the better off people, the educated, who brandished slogans like liberty and natural law and representation in order to defend their privileges. The same thing was going on in other parts of Europe. In 1786, there was a revolution in Holland, which had to be put down by Prussian troops. In 1788, there was a revolution in Belgium, and there was unrest throughout the Habsburg Empire, and all were directed against governments that tried to disturb old traditions, old institutions, to attack privileges, to introduce more rational reforms, more efficient administration. And that's just what happened in France. The French government, under a fairly able Minister of Finance, Charles de Calonne, tried to rationalize the management of the country, tried to move into the modern age by abolishing the anachronistic survivals of the feudal system. But paradoxically, the government tried to do this by reviving an old feudal institution, the Estates General, a representative assembly that had met just once since 1500 and not at all since 1614. The government wanted to play the third estate, the commoners, against the privileged orders. But the ploy failed and the third estate took over, claiming quite rightly that it really represented the nation. It declared itself the National Assembly, and after a lot of talk, much of it foolish, the representatives of the nobility and the clergy joined them, and that, in June 1789, was the beginning of the Constitutional Revolution. Then, on the 4th of August, in a great burst of enthusiasm, the Assembly abolished the feudal order. The sitting opened with a Viscount proposing the abolition of all economic privileges, no more forced labor, no more personal serfdom, no more tax exemptions. A duke supported him strongly, and the proposals were voted with enthusiasm. And after this, all particular privileges were sacrificed on the altar of the fatherland. Hunting rights went the way of all flesh. Guilds and corporations were suppressed. The clergy gave up their tithes. The magistrates who bought their offices gave them up too. And this went on until 2 o'clock in the morning. It's interesting to compare David's view of the crucial moment when the Third Estate swore never to separate until France got a written constitution like the Americans had, to compare this with a painting of the Oath of the Horatii, because the gestures are exactly the same, which demonstrates either that life imitates art or that artists imitate themselves. At any rate, when the sitting was over, the administrative and political unity of France had been achieved, something that absolute monarchy had always tried and never managed to do. And the old regime was dead. On its grave, 3 weeks later, the Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, full of echoes from America and more distant echoes of Locke and Rousseau. It might seem that by the end of August 1789, the French Revolution had been made, and that insofar as the public in London and Paris and Philadelphia was concerned, all was over but the cheering. Unfortunately, as you know, it wasn't over, because just as the king had played the Third Estate against the nobles, and the Third Estate had got the better of him, so the Third Estate, in order to get its way, raised up its own monster, and that was the people, the mob of Paris. Back on July the 14th, the Paris mob had stormed the Bastille, had torn it down, had set free the prisoners, had massacred the soldiers and the officers inside. It didn't matter that the old prison was practically empty, because its fall kept the reformers in power in the National Assembly. And then, while mobs rioted in urban France, peasant mobs had gone on the rampage in rural France as well, against the oppressive remains of the feudal system. This is the background of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And then in October 1789, the Paris mob, led and controlled by Paris market women, marched on Versailles. They massacred the king's guards. They brought the royal family back to Paris. The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy is what they called them. They brought the royal family out of their safe, splendid refuge into the capital of democracy. So the revolution had got out of hand. The National Assembly itself could not control it. And the snowball was about to become an avalanche, as we shall see next time.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.